Now, shocking as it is, Bill Browder's story isn't unique. Human Rights Watch said that Russia's civil rights record continues to deteriorate, and this morning, Russia's President Vladimir Putin addressed the UN General Assembly and, using offense as the best means of defense, took aim at the United States, saying that sanctions, quote, serve as a means of eliminating competition. But a lot of people will agree that Russia's economic problems are its own doing. The invasion of eastern Ukraine, the country's human rights record, and now Vladimir Putin's support of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. Joining me now is Stephen Cohen. He's a contributing editor to The Nation and a professor emeritus of Russian studies, history, and politics at NYU and Princeton. And I understand not a fan of Bill Browder's story.
I don't know what you're doing. I really don't. You asked me to come down here and talk about what might be the greatest international crisis of our time. Maybe the most monumental decision that President Obama and other world leaders have to decide about ISIS. And you begin with something called the enemy of Russia, Bill Browder.
But you know the story, right, of Bill Browder?
Everybody knows the story.
Right, so we couldn't have made that up.
No, but it's a very old story. And why would you link it to Putin at the UN?
Well, because I think it's important to understand who we're dealing with in the world.
You don't understand.
But I do understand it. The issue is that...
If you think what you just said characterizes adequately in this time of international crisis the leadership of Putin, you don't. So let me knit the two.
Hang on a second, Stephen. It sort of does. I mean, you do have to know who you're dealing with, right? If Vladimir Putin has been on the take with some of these oligarchs, and that's how he makes his decisions, that's important to know, because this administration that we're in, maybe you'll disagree with me on this, had decided that it wanted a reset with Russia, right? This administration has historically been Obama. Yeah. Right, so this is an administration that says they wanted to do more business with Russia when they came into office. And events, and tell me where I'm wrong, because you study this, events have changed that position. And your argument, as you saw them clinking glasses today, is that America and Russia have got to do business together. Well, I don't think the two stories are disconnected.
Well, you've certainly connected them.
Right.
Let me sum it up for you.
Okay.
And you decide about whether you've handled this properly.
Okay.
And I've been doing television for many, many years, and what you did with this Browder story, leading with it over what's going on at the UN, is, to say the least, unusual.
Okay.
Here's the situation. The greatest evil in the world today is this Islamic State. It's contagious, it's on the move, it's occupying large parts of Iraq and Syria. Nothing can stop it. It's threatening Europe. Millions of refugees will be there soon. It's destabilizing the Middle East. It's a direct threat to American national security. It's a direct threat to Russia's national security. So despite all their distaste for each other, Putin and Obama decided to sit down and talk about the possibility of a grand coalition against ISIS. Each has to decide, but whether you know it or not, and despite all this nonsense about having isolated Putin and turned him into a pariah that comes out of the White House, Putin has been very busy on the world scene. And when he arrived in New York today, he had already assembled a coalition against Islamic State, Syria, Iran, Iraq,
and as
Saudi Arabia.
As you know, we've covered this with very extensively. So if you don't like the Bill Browder story, you can't deny that it's true. You cannot deny that Vladimir Putin heads a government that has human rights problems. So that was the connection. I don't think it's unfair to talk about that.
Does Saudi Arabia have human rights problems?
Saudi Arabia has got a place on a panel of the Human Rights Committee at the United Nations. It's really quite remarkable. And I'll have the Saudi ambassador to the UN on the show this week to answer to that.
The point here is that whether or not this coalition is formed, and the coalition has left the station, Putin's put it together. So essentially, what Obama has to decide is whether he wants to get on the caboose. The train has left the station. And they're deciding that in their talks today and what follows. And they won't tell us exactly what they said. But bear in mind, far more important than Bill Browder, who, by the way, appears on your broadcast.
It's not more important than Bill Browder's lawyer, who was tortured and killed by Russian authorities. Steve, why do you have a problem with admitting that? Why do you have a problem? Do you doubt Bill Browder? Did you doubt that Sergei Magnitsky was killed by Russian forces in a prison after 400 days? That is separate and apart from global diplomacy.
The way we do journalism in America, or used to, is we don't put on one man who's selling a book to tell his story without another point of view. I know the Magnitsky case far better than you do.
Okay, and
far better. He died in prison in horrible conditions.
At
Yes.
the hands of Russian officials.
Yes, just the
He
way.
was charged and tried as a dead man. When was the last time you heard that happen? A dead person tried in court. See, what's wrong with saying that Russians don't do everything right? And that maybe they do some things right?
I've spent 40 years.
Why are you defending this that way? Are you defending Russian actions against Sergei Magnitsky?
I object as strongly as I can for you putting words in my mouth.
Okay, but
I
do
am
you
not
object
defending
to the Russians having killed Sergei Magnitsky? Because that's what you need to object, not by me bringing that story to the American people.
This is absolutely preposterous. I mean, we're talking about the greatest crisis in the world today.
Why did you talk about it?
You haven't given me a chance. You led with Magnitsky.
You came in and told me that it was preposterous to discuss Bill Browder and Sergei Magnitsky.
Let me put it in
I don't think it's preposterous to do that.
Let me put it. Your priorities aren't right. Your priorities aren't right either in terms of what's really at stake in the world today or what's news. So to finish the point, if you want to know the bigger picture and you care about the national security of the United States, at least that. And footnote. Yes, I care that Magnitsky died in prison.
At the hands of the Russians.
Well,
nobody else killed him. The Russians held him and they killed him. All I'm saying is,
if you die in a prison, you die at the hands of the authorities of that country. Do you know how many Americans have died, even unconvicted, in American prisons in the last 20 or 30 years? Do you know the number?
They weren't beaten to death.
They weren't? You know that.
Well, you are telling me that there are a number of
nobody's ever been beaten to death at Rikers
I know
Island?
that nobody's been beaten to death, but we have a case of somebody who's actually been beaten to death in a Russian prison.
But what
I just
lesson?
don't get
What
you're
lesson?
getting from defending it. We can accept that the Russians did something to Magnitsky.
I'm not defending that at all.
And then we can talk about the value that the Russians.
Well, I kind of doubt this is going to make air to begin with.
It's all going to make.
We're just going to sit here and have an argument.
It's all going to make.
And if I can get my point out.
Go ahead.
Then we can. If you really want to talk about Browder,
right? I'm trying.
If you want me to tell you what I know about Browder that you don't know,
okay.
But I'll just leave you with one question: okay. How did anybody, a Russian American in particular, make, as you put it, billions of dollars in lawless, murderous, illegal Russia in the 1990s?
Because they were privatizing, and every Russian got a voucher. You know this, right? Every Russian got a voucher that was part of the privatization.
I wrote a book.
Right. So you're not disputing that.
I wrote a book about it. I know about it.
Right.
I fear, from what you just said, you don't know about it. Now we can have a separate discussion about privatization in the 1990s.
So did Russians not have the opportunity to buy pieces of government companies, government-owned companies that were being made private?
It was a scheme, and the wealth of the country fell into the hands of a handful of insiders. Browder, willy or nilly, knowingly or unknowingly, was part of that. Okay. You lie down with dogs, you get up with fleas, and everything that followed is largely an attempt for him to whitewash his career in Russia. He's waging the death of his lawyer. The lawyer wasn't the only one they killed. They killed a lot of people.
I agree with you.
You know how many people have been assassinated in Russia? And almost all of it is tied not to
But you can see my research. This wasn't actually about a discussion about Bill Browder. It was a discussion about Russia. It's a discussion about Eastern Ukraine. I want to get to that.
Let me make let me make my point, and then we can quit, or you can do it. It's your show. I gotta let you go anyway. Back for a moment to the UN. Unfortunately, speaking as an American patriot, not as a defender of Russia, and I object to you saying that to me. I've been at this too many years.
What do I call you a defender of Russia?
You said, why are you defending the death of Magnitsky?
You are not prepared to say what it is. You keep going back to it. You keep
Magnitsky died in horrible circumstances in a Russian prison. Are you asking me if I defend that? Really? You're asking me if I defend that?
No, I'm saying you're discounting it.
It's an insult. I'm not discounting it.
Okay, well then
I'm just saying.
It's valid to talk about it.
Well, you talk about it. Can we go to the real point?
Yes.
Alas, that means unfortunately for those people who don't hear, it's an old word, alas. Two of President Obama's fundamental policies have failed. And it's not that I'm saying so. The Obama administration is admitting it. One was the attempt to destroy militarily the Islamic State. They were testifying in Congress it's been a failure. The other was, to use President Obama's own words about 16 months ago, to isolate Putin's Russia. Both policies have failed. How do we know that? Because when President Obama agreed to meet Putin, or Putin agreed to meet Obama today, it was a recognition on the part of the White House that both policies have failed. Right now, Putin says he has a solution to the Islamic State problem, which is what we should be discussing. Is it a plausible solution? We don't know for sure what they said between each other. But assuming that Obama knows his policy has failed, and he now needs Putin for the second time in 2 years in Syria, you remember the chemical gas thing, one assumes that they are doing some cooperation. Leaders at that level never tell us fully what they really said to each other. Both are vulnerable at home politically. But when Putin said today at the UN, think in terms of the World War II alliance against Hitler, we might reasonably ask ourselves, instead of thinking about Mr. Browder, could Roosevelt and Churchill unite with Stalin, who was a monster, and Putin is no kind of Stalin, to defeat Hitler? But we can't unite with Putin to defeat today's evil, the ISIS state. Obama's enemies and the people who have demonized Putin, as Browder has been doing in Washington, will accuse Obama of appeasement, right? So that'll be the dialogue. But keep in mind what's at stake, keep in mind the failed American policies, and keep in mind that the Islamic State is a grave menace to Russia.
And keep in mind that that's why I invited you on the show, to make that point, that there are people who will demonize Russia and China and Iran and Cuba, and we have to have the discussion about whether engagement with these countries is better than not engaging with them.
I'm sort of, we could turn this into a Saturday Night Live skit. I could say to you now, Ali, are you saying that maybe if Obama isn't careful, Putin will kill him in a prison if he goes ahead?
I'm not saying that.
What's the tie?
I'm saying that there wasn't Russia.
What's the link
between Browder and Ukraine and the UN?
What's the link? You say there's
Russia.
What's the link?
Russia.
What's the link? I know it's Russia.
It's Russia. It's about the fact that we are dealing with a regime that doesn't always do the right things. And one can make the argument that neither does the U.S. do the right things all the time, or China, but we engage with them. Nor does Cuba, but we engage with them. There's a deal with Iran. We engage with them, that we don't think they kill more people per capita than any country on earth. That's the reason I invited you here, to have that discussion. But you're so steamed about Bill Browder.
No, you want to know what I'm really steamed about? No, I don't want to say it on air. It's not fair. You bushwhacked me. There was no, I talked to your producers, and all we talked about was the UN, Syria, Putin, and Russia, and you lead with a segment on strike.
My viewers don't see
But I didn't walk out. I came here with you.
But we're talking about Syria, we're talking about terrorism, we're talking about Ukraine, we're talking about NATO, Russia proxies. That's my research. That's what I wanted to talk to you about. But you came in here so mad about Bill Browder.
I wasn't mad.
That you won't talk to me. That's what I want to talk about. You're an expert on NATO countries. You're an expert on these former Soviet countries. Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania.
Just Russia.
That all joined NATO, and Ukraine wanted to.
No,
and you're saying
Ukraine didn't want to.
Ukraine wants to join NATO.
Oh, it wants to. Wait, get your verb tenses right. You said it wanted to, and now it wants to.
Okay, but the bottom line is that's what I wanted to
talk about. It matters to historians
whether
when you're talking
whether
about
or not that pushes Russia into a situation where they've had to act the way they have. That's actually what I booked you to talk about. My producer didn't lie to you.
No, I never know he lied to me. No, I'm not mad about Bill Browder. Let's go get away from Browder.
Okay, so let me ask you my question.
What do we do?
Okay, so let me ask you that question.
What do we?
If you're Russia, all of those countries that were in your sphere of influence during the Soviet days are now in the Western sphere of influence. So Russia, some argue, feels backed up and needs to react aggressively, and did so in Ukraine. How do we deal with that? Because they have made that argument. I think the argument has been that they're a coiled spring.
I got it. Well, in the English language, there are these two concepts of leadership. One is proactive, which would be aggressive, and one is reactive, which means you've just shoved me, I fall back, come back, and I shove you back. My view of Putin, both as a Russian historian, been studying Russia, and from the perspective of American national security, is that we've pushed, and then finally he pushed back. Let me give you a footnote to that. In Moscow, which I visit not as often as in the past, but I still visit, there are influential ultra-nationals who believe that today, in private talks with Obama, Putin sold out Ukraine in return for Syria. They don't trust him. And why don't they trust him? They think he's too pro-Western. And why do they think he's too pro-Western? Because he never strikes first. He's a counter-puncher, if you want to put in that language. They don't think he's a fit leader for Russia today. Analytically, that's not my perspective. But there's a politics in Moscow. So just as Obama's going to go back to Washington and we're going to hear you appease Putin, the monster, the guy who killed Magnitsky, how can you do this? Putin's going to go home and say, so what private deal did you sell out our comrades in Donbass in Ukraine?
Right.
So there are many sides to the story.
I will leave you with this. You were probably walking in, so you probably didn't hear it. Okay. But the tease before you came in said that sometimes to get along, you have to go along. Coming up, I'm talking to a man who says America needs Russia too much to take a stand. I wanted to talk to you about American diplomatic relations with Russia, not about Bill Browder, not about Sergei Magnitsky.
But it's clear.
Just so you know,
what we said is clear. It's clear.
That's what I want to have you on for, and I always appreciate.
And
you
just to pay you the ultimate compliment.
Yeah.
This was almost as much fun as hanging out with Putin.
Stephen Cohen, good to talk to you. Thank you so much for being with us as always. And that is our show for today. I'm Ali Velshi. Thank you for joining us. The news continues on Al Jazeera America.